Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our August 3rd edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today we're bringing you insights from both sides of the free trade and tariffs debate that has captured news headlines and ag policy discussions in recent years. With no bigger issue facing agriculture right now, we decided to make trade the theme of Iowa Farm Bureau's 2026 Economic Summit, welcoming a wide range of experts with unique perspectives on the global marketplace to share their diverse views and expertise with Iowa farmers and ag professionals during the day-long event. It was that desire for diverse viewpoints at the Economic Summit that brought us renowned policy thinkers like Dr. Sam Gregg of the American Institute for Economic Research and Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, who was the former U.S. trade representative under President Trump. These two gentlemen come at trade from two totally different directions, representing the very real policy debates that are happening in Washington. You'll hear from both of them in a moment. But first, we'll start with Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johnson, who took some time after the Economic Summit to talk with spokesman editor Tom Block about the importance of trade and why it's more important than ever for farmers and ag professionals to participate in the conversations that are reshaping the market for U.S. ag products.
Brent, the 2026 Farm Bureau Economic Summit brought together a wide range of opinions on trade. As you reflect on the event, what was the intention of bringing all these different voices together, and what were some of your high-level takeaways?
When we were thinking about our economic summit for this year, what's the hot topics? What are folks feeling? And obviously, the overriding conversations have been around trade. There's been a divergence in our nation's trade policies since President Trump took office the first time. And so there's been a divergence on free trade versus fair trade and what that might look like and how did we get there and what does that mean and all those questions that come around it. So when we were thinking about this economic summit, that became the focus of this program. And so then to have opinions, voices, and experts on either side and just to not promote one methodology or the other, but to display what those differences are, why they're there, and find some reasons, rationales into some of those thinkings. And hopefully the folks who attend the program can get to the space in their own mind, either if it's for themselves or their farm or their business, whatever brought them here, so that they can have a broader perspective, a deeper understanding, and hopefully some decision making and some pathways forward into whichever pathway this country ultimately decides that it's going to go. We just wanted to present a fair and balanced perspective on both sides of the equation.
Now, the keynote of the event was a one-on-one conversation between yourself and former U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, who negotiated some major trade deals during the first Trump administration. To what extent do you think his perspectives reflect the current administration's approach to trade? And what did you want to make sure that he and current trade negotiators understand about the impact that trade wars and tariffs have had on Iowa farmers?
Well, like I said, the first Trump administration was the first administration in a long time who changed our trade policy. And to be fair, Bob Lighthizer is kind of the architect of what that is. But President Trump, I think, has a long tenured history of being in that same frame of mind. So Ambassador Lighthizer built the road, I guess, if you will, for this current tenureship of trade negotiations. And it did align with President Trump's vision that he's carried for decades, to be honest. And so for this now, the second Trump administration, to continue some of those methodologies, I don't think anybody should find that surprising. You can agree or you can disagree, but the fact is that those ideologies align in this administration. The question is, where do we go from here? And some of the conversations that I had with Ambassador Lighthizer on stage really had to do with the fact of zeroing in and focusing on the agriculture industry and in specific to all of these fair trade conversations. I did have the opportunity to speak with Ambassador Lighthizer a fair amount over several days and got to understand a little bit of at least his understanding and where he's coming at things. And many times in our personal conversations, he was talking about the U.S. economy on a broad scale, on other industries outside of agriculture. He talked a lot about car parts and he talked a lot about manufacturing and so on and so on. So some of those trade imbalances, that was a lot of the focus. And so to bring trade policy forward for the United States economy, in this aspect, agriculture suffers because we're affected by trade on the input side of the balance sheet and we're affected by trade on the export side of the balance sheet. So we get that razor's edge on both sides of this conversation. And so when I was on stage with Ambassador Lighthizer, I really wanted him to understand that. He's not a part of the administration anymore, but at least the architect of this current trade policy has a takeaway and an understanding of the effect that those policies had on the attendees and the participants in our economic summit. That was the goal. And also for the audience members to understand the whys and possibly how, as a farmer, how am I going to negotiate something like this? How can I navigate this current circumstance? Is this a flash in the pan? Is this something we're going to have to deal with? You know, what's the longevity? All those questions are yet to be answered. But I think it's clear that we still have another 2.5 years of the Trump administration. Don't expect that to change in that period of time. After this administration, you know, that page is yet to be turned.
And those same points that you made to Ambassador Lighthizer, I know you've made to multiple members of the Trump administration and Iowa's congressional delegation and basically everyone that you talk to. So looking forward, where does the conversation go from here, both on trade and building demand? And how is Farm Bureau part of that conversation?
Those are kind of the high-level talking points. As you said, when I talk with current trade representatives or, you know, Secretary Rowlands or other folks of this administration, the United States is very good at, but Iowa is uniquely superior at outproducing our own domestic ability to consume. What that means is Iowa's farmers are literally the best in the world at what we do. And there is absolutely no way that we can today consume everything that's being produced. And so the profit margins inherently then rely on the trade aspects. I'm consistently advocating for domestic use policies every time I go to Washington, D.C., every time I'm having a conversation with our congressional delegation or those in leadership who have some authority to do something about that. Things like E15, Proposition 12. I am constantly having those conversations with those folks so that we can do a better job of domestically consuming our products. But the reality is we have a trade requirement to achieve profitability in the state like Iowa, where we produce so much corn, soybeans, hogs, and even biofuels. We really rely on the export markets there to add value to those. And we're going to have to continue to work on those domestic use policies because, you know, trade around the world is going to change in the years to come. I've talked about that in some of our other programs, but, you know, today we need trade plus we need domestic use. Where we're going in the future, a lot more value add, a lot more domestic use, but we need to continue to focus on trade as well. Is that fair trade? Is that free trade? That's the question that we were trying to explore in our economic summit.
And to that point, Farm Bureau has taken an active role in just having those conversations. We bring people here to the office. We send people, board members and yourself, multiple times overseas and just having conversations and trying to open doors.
Oh, absolutely. You know, we've been to multiple countries in the past years. I myself have been in, you know, feed mills and government agencies on the other side of the globe, you know, trying to promote the quality and consistency of the products that we raise here. And we're going to continue to do that. I'm currently working on 3 separate trade missions and how we're going to navigate those in the future. That is and has to be a part of our conversations. But we also need to do a better job in the United States of domestically adding value and finding uses for and being creative with the things that we are so good at here, and really put a strong foundation under that domestically and paint a positive future profitability into production agriculture for not only tomorrow, but well into the future.
Thanks, Brent. As Brent mentioned, that economic summit was a really thought-provoking event, which is what you get when you bring in different perspectives on a hot topic like trade. To make the case for free trade, we invited experts like Dr. Sam Gregg of the American Institute for Economic Research, who caught up with Spokesman editor Tom Block at the summit.
Dr. Gregg, you have a very interesting and somewhat unique background as a trade historian and economist. So to begin with, what led you down this path of becoming an expert on the political and economic impacts of trade? And how was that manifested through your work at the American Institute for Economic Research?
I think the main reason I got interested in this topic was that the country got very interested in this topic about 10 years ago now, in 2016. Trade has been debated for a long time in the United States, going all the way back to the founding and even before that as well. But over the past 10 years, we've seen an acceleration in the number of people who have been questioning what had been hitherto the accepted orthodoxy, that trade liberalization was good for the country, for particular industries, particularly for agriculture, etc. And that was all turned upside down in 2015, 2016, when you had a lot of people across the political spectrum, I should say, who called into question that orthodoxy that had been prevalent in America really since the end of the Second World War. Now, I'm a free trader. I very much believe in trade liberalization. I think it's good for America. I think it's good for American consumers. I think it's good for American businesses. I think outside competition makes us stronger. But there's a lot of people in America who have a very different view to that. And I wanted to understand why they had these views, what policy conclusions they drew from that, but also how I could present my own arguments saying why I thought that their views were mistaken. And as soon as I started doing that, and that was about the middle of 2015, it's been a non-stop roller coaster since then, because and it's not just in America, around the world, this is being debated in a way that it hasn't been debated for a very long period of time. And I think those of us who were free traders, we had sort of assumed that we'd won all the arguments. We had assumed that the argument about trade was over. But it turned out that we were wrong, and what that's meant that is people like myself have had to go back and refresh our ideas, fit them up for the new context of our time, but also engage people where they are and what they think about trade. And what I try to do is to show them that I believe in free trade, not because I'm a sort of heartless cosmopolitan globalist. I believe in free trade because I think it's the best trade policy for the United States.
And let's talk a little more about that. The title of your talk is Why Free Trade Matters. So what is your argument for that? Why does free trade matter, especially for agriculture?
Well, free trade matters for a lot of reasons. I think, for one thing, it's good for American consumers. And the purpose of the economy is to meet consumer wants and needs. That's what Adam Smith said that 250 years ago in his book, The Wealth of Nations. And trade with other countries means that we can engage and discover what is our comparative advantage. We can open new markets for American goods, and I think that's actually particularly important for American agriculture, because American agriculture is a net exporter of its products to the rest of the world. And there's a lot of people out there who are anxious for American agricultural products. And free trade is what enables us to get into their markets. Whereas if you play the protectionist game, You don't only try and inhibit people from selling their goods in the United States, you also make it harder to penetrate into foreign markets so that you can get your goods, American agricultural goods, into foreign markets. So I think those are some reasons for consumers, but I also think it's good for American businesses because I think competition is very good for businesses. And it doesn't really matter whether the competition is domestic or foreign. It's just competition. And we do know that countries that try to shield themselves off from foreign competition tend to get lazy, tend to get complacent, tend to lose sight of what truly is their comparative advantage and how it's changing. They also, I think, end up not actually protecting the industries that they think they're protecting by using things like tariffs or industrial policy. Because in the end, I think these industries, if they're not competitive, globally speaking, in the long run, they're not going to survive. And it doesn't matter how much protection you put up to try and shield them from foreign competition. At some point, that protection is not going to work anymore. And we also know that that protection is going to damage those industries, but also result in higher prices for American goods and American consumers over the long period. I also think that free trade is also good for American national security. The reason I say that is because when you end up engaging in trade with other countries, it tends to make them more friendly to you. Now, I don't believe that trade is something that will just end all wars. I'm not one of these people who thinks that free trade will result in universal peace everywhere throughout the world. But I do think it inclines nations to become more friendly to you when you open up your markets to them and they open up their markets to you, because you're both finding mutual benefits through that process. And countries that are experiencing mutual benefits through trade tend to be a little bit more cautious about getting into protracted conflicts with other nations. So I think it's good for American consumers. I think it's good for American businesses. I think it's good for the country as a whole. And I also think it's good for American national security.
Yeah, hopefully you're also more prosperous, more friendly. And if you do the flip side, as you said, you start to escalate, it just becomes a game of you tariff me, and so I'm going to tariff you.
It's a race to the bottom. It literally is a race to the bottom, because when we put tariffs on other countries, what we're really doing is saying we're cutting off our nose to spite our face, because what we're basically saying is, okay, we're going to make it harder for you to sell your goods and products into the United States, and that results in higher prices, because it means that the goods that Americans are buying, American consumers are buying, the prices go up. It also means that American businesses can't source goods and services and inputs that they use for their own production as easily or as cheaply as they were able to do before. So when you get into tariff wars, it's an exercise in mutually assured destruction. Now, I happen to think that when countries impose tariffs on us, that's bad. It's not good for us. But I think it's usually a mistake to retaliate, because you end up, yes, you do some harm to the other person, but you also do significant harm to your own economy as well.
So over the course of history, what have been the drivers of U.S. trade policy, and how has that changed over time from one administration to the next?
I used to say there were three periods of the history of trade in America. One was what we call revenue. So this is basically from about the founding up until the end of the Civil War. And tariffs at that point were not so much about protectionism. Tariffs were a source of revenue for the federal government. The federal government had no income tax at the time. Tariffs were how they basically funded the federal government. So it was seen as a revenue source. It wasn't used as a tool. Tariffs were not used as a tool to try and inflict damage upon other countries. So it was relatively neutral in the way that it played out. Then after the Civil War, we move into a period of restriction, whereby tariffs do take on this type of protectionist function. And that was mainly because during the Civil War, tariffs were raised very heavily to help fund the federal government to fight the South. But it's also the case that once those tariffs were in place, they become very hard to dislodge. The reason they become hard to dislodge is because any number of businesses who believe that they do or will benefit from tariffs will lobby legislators very, very hard to get preferential treatment in the form of tariffs being applied against their foreign competitors. It's also interesting because at this period of time, the North was very protectionist because they did not think they could compete with British industry, Britain being the economic global power at the time and the economic superpower, and American businesses in the North were very worried that they couldn't compete. And so they thought, well, we'll use tariffs to protect ourselves against this British juggernaut. In the South, but also in agricultural parts of the country, the sentiment was free trade. And the sentiment was free trade because farmers wanted to export as much of their agricultural surpluses around the world as they could because they had huge surpluses that were not being fully consumed in the United States. So this period of restriction, which basically lasted from 1860 up until around about 1933, was the federal government taking the view that we're going to use tariffs for protection. And there was enormous debate in the United States about this subject that went on for about 60 years. Then from 1933 up until relatively recently, American trade policy moved in the direction of what's called reciprocity, whereby American policymakers decided that we want to benefit from the good effects of free trade that we previously talked about, but we also want to use trade as a way of buttressing American alliances around the world. So I think a lot of trade policy from about 1945 up until 1990 is explainable in terms of the United States basically getting into foreign markets so that they could stave off pressures that were coming from the Soviet Union, from the communist bloc, to take over other countries around the world. So trade formed part of this effort for the United States to build these alliances of like-minded countries that had a lot of economic interests in common, and free trade was a very good way of cementing that. But now I think we're in a different phase. We're basically from 2016 onwards. We've gone back into a type of restrictionist approach. And it's not just with the Trump administration, I should add. The Biden administration kept in place more or less the same trade policies that the first Trump administration did. And that adds up to what I'll call a type of neo-mercantilist set of policies. By neo-mercantilism, I mean tariffs, I mean the use of industrial policy to try and drive the US economy in particular directions that markets wouldn't necessarily take them. I also think it's manifested in things like the government taking ownership stakes in companies, in steel, for example, some car companies, etc. So tariffs form part of that neo-mercantilist turn that we've seen with Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2. It's actually more restrictionist, I think, than the restrictionist period that existed between 1860 and 1933. So if you look at all those forces, what's going on? National security concerns are driving this. Domestic politics are driving this as different lobby groups are trying to secure different favors. There's conflicts within the country between those who believe that free trade is good for the country and good for their industry. And there are others who are saying, no, we need tariffs because it's good for the country, but it's also good for our industry. I often like to remind people, if you look at the second half of the 19th century, after the topic of slavery, the subject that most divided Americans was trade policy. This is what elections were fought over. So in some respects, we're back in that period to a certain way. And so what you see is this sort of ebbs and flows in trade policy. And some of it has to do with ideas, but a lot of it has to do with domestic and international politics.
Yeah, very interesting. And you talk about, I don't know if driven by fear or what, but trying to reshore manufacturing here. We saw a lot of manufacturing leave the United States, and well, tariffs will bring all this back. But what's your answer to that?
I guess I'd describe it this way. So manufacturing is a lot of the core of the discussions about trade policy in the United States today. And there is this sense that because of trade liberalization, America lost a lot of manufacturing jobs to countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, but above all, China. But I think the story is a lot more complicated than that. I don't think trade liberalization has very much to do with what happened with manufacturing. What happened with manufacturing was technology. technology changed the way that things were done. It produced a lot of labor-saving devices that replaced the need for humans to do all sorts of, frankly, very physically demanding and often dangerous forms of work. So we are still one of the world's leading manufacturing countries. I think we're in most of these indices, we either rank number 1 or number 2 in the world. What's changed is the way we do manufacturing. So we do a lot of high-tech manufacturing. So if you go into a manufacturing plant in the United States today, 60 years ago, you would have seen sort of burly men walking around with overalls and that sort of stereotype. When you go into a lot of manufacturing plants today, what do you see? You see men and women walking around with lab coats on. And you're operating highly sophisticated machinery and technology to build highly sophisticated technological products, which we then export outside the United States. So I actually don't think China has very much to do with what's happened to manufacturing. What's happened is we've transitioned from one form of manufacturing to another, one that requires less people working. But it's not as if the overall employment levels of the United States have suddenly dropped. What's happened is a lot of people who once worked in manufacturing or once would have worked in manufacturing, they're now working in the service sector, which is where the bulk of jobs are in the United States today. So that's my story about what's happened to manufacturing. And it's a story that's quite different to what we commonly hear when we hear particularly political leaders when they're talking about manufacturing. But I think that's a more accurate take on what has happened. And that's what happens if you have a dynamic economy. You have things change. And now, I don't want to downplay the fact that change can be difficult. Transitioning is very hard. But the good news is, I think, and again, this is, I think, another story that's not told enough, is that most of those towns, those manufacturing towns that opted to change, who said, there's no point making furniture anymore. They do that better in another country. We need to transform our local economy into something else. Most of those cities and parts of the country that have done that have made the transition. I'm not downplaying its difficulties. It was hard, but they've made the transition and now they're doing very well. I'm thinking of cities like Pittsburgh, for example. It's changed dramatically and in very good ways. But those cities that opted for tariffs, like Detroit, or opted for federal assistance, like quite a few towns in the Midwest, in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, guess what? They're still asking for subsidies. They still have high levels of unemployment. They still have high levels of the sorts of social pathologies that accompany economic decline. In other words, even if you believe that trade policy has somehow had a major effect on manufacturing employment, even if you believe that, which I think is wrong, but if you believe that, you also come up against the fact that protectionist and interventionist policies have not fixed the problem.
Let's talk about tariffs. And tariffs are often talked about as a source of revenue. And you have an interesting chart on one of your slides about tariff revenue funding the government. And for the first, say, 100 years, they actually did fund a significant share of the government. But you also point out that has changed as the government has grown. So what's your answer to those who say we're doing these tariffs and the revenue is going to help us somehow?
Well, we have had revenue coming in as a consequence of the tariffs, more revenue coming in, but it's not a lot more than was coming in before. And the reason is that the volume of trade hasn't changed that much. So that's one thing. The second thing is that even if you said, well, let's try and fund the federal government through tariffs, you would never raise enough revenue that of the type and scale that you would need if you were going to be able to fund the federal government, because the federal government today is so much more of a behemoth than it was in, say, 1790 or 1900, or even up until 1929. The size of the government is just so much bigger now. Our income tax system doesn't even cover the full costs of what the government does in the United States today. So to imagine that tariffs would somehow make up the difference, I think is fanciful. It's not a serious position. I think that even if you were slapping on 100%, 200% tariffs, for one thing, I think you'd have a lot of people who would just stop trading with the United States, so you'd lose the revenue anyway. But even if they kept trading, you would not get anywhere near the amounts of money that you need to fund what the federal government does today.
How has the U.S. trade relationship with China changed here recently? And where do things stand today? And it's not good in some cases, but can that relationship between the two countries be repaired?
So I think the relationship has certainly changed since 2012, which is when Xi came to power, and it was very clear that he had a very different set of economic policies compared to his predecessors. His predecessors, ranging from Deng onwards, from 1980 onwards, had tried to open up the Chinese economy to trade from abroad. It worked out very well for the United States because we managed to have a lot of exports of agricultural products and other such things to China, and they sent us a lot of consumer goods at a lot less cost than we were otherwise purchasing them in the United States. So it was fantastic for American consumers. So that's one thing. But that has changed because Xi clearly has a very different vision of what he thinks the Chinese economy wants to be like. He wants it to be a much more state-orientated, state-driven type of economy. I think he wants as planned as an economy he can have up to the point where that's consistent with having some degree of economic growth. So that's a very different type of beast that we're dealing with compared from between 1980 up until about 2012. One thing that has happened, which has also changed in the relationship, is that American businesses are doing a lot less business in China. And one of the reasons they're doing less business in China is, one, China has lost its major comparative advantage, which was cheap labor, because of their one-child policy, which robbed them of what was their biggest economic advantage, cheap labor. But also, American businesses are finding the cost of doing business in China is just getting harder and harder because property rights and rule of law are becoming weaker to the extent that they even existed in the first place, are becoming weaker and weaker by the day. So what that means is that if you're an American business, let's say you're an American agricultural business doing things in China, and you get into a dispute with your Chinese business partner, then you're probably going to end up in front of a Chinese court, and I'm pretty sure the Chinese court is not going to rule in your favor. So the incentives to do business in China have radically declined, which is why I think a lot of businesses, American businesses, have either brought some things back to the United States or they've pivoted to countries in Southeast Asia where there's lots of economic opportunities and fewer of the problems that they have to deal with when they engage with China. So the relationship has changed both on a macro level, but also on the micro level of everyday businesses who are doing a lot of different things in China. Now, that said, there's still things that we want from China. There's still things that China wants from us. But the amount of trade, the volume of trade, has declined significantly. They are no longer our biggest trading partner. Our biggest trading partners are Mexico, Canada, and Japan. China is rapidly falling down the list.
So to summarize here, and you mentioned early on, one of the benefits of trade is when you're in a position of surplus, and you'll find out in your visit to Iowa, agriculture is in a position of surplus. So what do you see as the future of free trade, and what's the best way to accomplish that? Is it a multi-country arrangement like the World Trade Organization, or more of a bilateral approach, or a combination of the two?
Well, American agriculture, as you know, is incredibly efficient. It's incredibly productive. It produces surpluses every year. And I think the number of people who work in agriculture is very small, certainly compared to what it was like 125 years ago. It's much smaller. But it is nonetheless extremely productive, and we need access to external markets to sell our surplus agricultural goods. That's a good thing. That's an opportunity. So I would hope that farmers and agricultural associations are talking to whoever is in power in the White House and anyone, or their legislators, their senators, to explain to them that there's an enormous opportunity for American farmers in terms of their ability to produce a lot of things that can be easily exported to other countries that want American agricultural products. So I think it behooves American farmers and those who work in agriculture to work very hard to try and get these markets open more widely for American goods. So that's one thing. I think a second thing is that I don't think we're going back anytime soon to the type of World Trade Organized multilateral agreements that we had for a long period of time after the Second World War. That's how a lot of trade liberalization occurred, when everyone signed up to these pacts whereby everyone would agree that a whole range of different conditions, but overall it would reduce trade barriers. I don't see that happening now. The reason I say that is because I think the World Trade Organization it's probably too big. It's 166 members. Getting them all to agree is extremely difficult. And that's why these trade negotiations take decades. So that's one thing. And also I think there's just a lot of conflict between different countries now that is going to manifest itself there not just between China and America, but between China and India, Europe and Russia, etc., that makes multilateral trade agreements even more of a far-off prospect than they were before. So I think we should be trying to pursue trade agreements of whatever type we can get in the conditions that we find ourselves. Now, sometimes that means bilateral agreements. I tend to think plurilateral agreements are the best way forward at the moment, because that's when you get a group of countries together and they say, okay, we are going to agree upon these rules, and anyone who wants to agree to these rules is welcome to join this particular trade pact. Those, I think, are probably the most optimal way forward right now, because it involves more than just two countries, and they're capable of being opened up to more members coming in as long as they agree upon the terms upon which the original agreement was established. I think that's more or less the future. I think another thing is that, and I think this is particularly relevant for agriculture, I think that the global economy's epicenter, it's no longer in the Atlantic, it's no longer America and Europe, it's really the Asia-Pacific region now. 60% of the world GDP is located in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, that's partly because you have China and the United States and Japan in that particular part of the world, but you have also a lot of these Asian countries that are still powering ahead, they're still growing rapidly, they're anxious and wanting to trade with big countries like the United States. There's enormous opportunities in the Asia-Pacific region that I think we should be part of. I often like to say to people that Americans have been trading in the Asia-Pacific region before the American Revolution. We had American merchants going to places like China in the 1780s. The first ship that was actually called the Empress of China that ended up going to China to trade there, and this was just after independence. So there's always been an American presence. Even before America acquired California, there's always been an American presence in the Pacific. There's a very strong legacy which American businesses, I think, could build upon, and to be part of that growing and very exciting part of the world with all its problems, and there are plenty of problems there, I think that's the future for American trade, certainly for the next couple of decades.
Thanks, Dr. Gregg. Clearly, there's a compelling case to open new markets for U.S. ag products overseas, which is why you heard President Brent Johnson allude to Iowa Farm Bureau's previous and upcoming trade missions earlier in this episode. Of course, farmers want America's trade deals to work for agriculture and other sectors of the U.S. economy. Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, who was the U.S. trade representative during President Trump's first term in office, says that too often that's not the case. He made that point during a fireside chat with Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johnson at the Economic Summit and during a separate sit-down interview with Tom Block.
Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you for joining us. As we look at how trade policies and trade disputes have unfolded since your time in the Trump administration until now, what relationships or negotiations have aligned with your expectations, and was there anything that has surprised you?
Well, Tom, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy being in Iowa. Nothing really surprises me anymore. When you've been doing it for 40 years, it's all kind of your expectations are sort of set pretty well. I think that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, understands a couple of things. One, that the free trade and the trading system itself is broken, very broken. Two, that trade is very important to agriculture. it's maybe 20% of revenue, but its impact is far greater, and particularly in Iowa, where we're corn and soybean reliant. And commodities, obviously, is more important than it is in some other things, too. So what the president is trying to do is realize that the basic system is broken, is do transactional deals. Gain access, basically leveraging access to the U.S. market by our competitors. In the past, that was largely done, if you just think about it from an agriculture point of view, it was basically trading off agriculture jobs and income, oftentimes for manufacturing ones. That ended up really not being a very good trade-off. The way the president did instead was the president's sort of take was, why don't we do this? Why don't we just say, we'll put tariffs on you and knock you out of our market? I'm not going to give up any more U.S. jobs. We have $1 trillion trade deficit. So we're going to get more ag access, really, by just threatening people that if you don't balance your trade with us, and buying agriculture is a very important way to do it, then we're going to limit your access to the U.S. market. And that has been successful. If you look at, exports, of course, there's a lot of things driving exports more than just trade policy, obviously, right? The important things like the value of the currency and the like. But I think the president has done a very good job, and they're continuing that. I don't think much happened during the Biden years. I think as a general matter, the Biden policy was a good policy in that it continued Trump's general direction, didn't reverse it, which I'm happy about. But they didn't really do a lot of new initiatives. And I think in this new administration, in the year and a half or so that we're looking at, there have been a number of new deals and a lot more access for ag products. So I'm pretty pleased with the direction of it all. As I say, the health of the ag economy depends on an awful lot more than trade. But on the trade section of it, that's, I think things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, farmers do understand and support efforts to fix a broken system and confront those unfair trade practices. But what we see often is the retaliation. Farmers are also often the first ones to get hit back. So as these negotiations continue, is there any way to gauge how long it might take to see a satisfactory outcome, especially with the big partners, China and Canada and Mexico? As you mentioned, there are lots of other deals that have been worked, so we're seeing some progress, but any way to gauge how long it may take for those bigger markets?
Well, first of all, one subset of the question is for trade overall. Remember, we have $1 trillion plus trade deficit, and it's year after year after year. And it's not because Americans are consumption crazy or lazy or stupid. It's because other countries have industrial policies that are designed really to export their unemployment to us. So we have to deal with that problem as a general matter. On the general problem of agriculture trade, let's kind of break it down, because looking at a time frame depends on that. Canada and Mexico, we have an enormous amount of agriculture trade with them, and in fact have deficits in both categories. Not particularly in commodity products, but overall. We have substantial deficits with Canada and Mexico, and there are two big export countries, and they are the principal reason why we have a deficit in agriculture for the first time in our life, right, in the history of the country. So which is unnerving. But the real problem is China, right? And I don't think you can kind of lump China, Mexico, Canada, because they're totally different, right? In the case of China, we have to be realistic. Does China retaliate? Of course. China buys most of the soybeans, and I know you know this, most of the soybeans in trade in the world. And China is a geopolitical adversary. So their buying soybeans from the United States is extremely important. Now, to the extent that Brazil sells their soybeans to China and we sell ours to Europe, then the effect is kind of mitigated. But overall, this is a leverage point for China. China is a geopolitical adversary. China wants nothing good for the United States. They're not a friend. They know that they can leverage agriculture to hurt America's economy, to hurt America's working people, and they're willing to do that. China runs a gigantic trade surplus with the United States, and one of the few bright spots from our point of view is soybeans, and so they use that. So you have a number of things that you have to think about. One, as a matter of domestic policy, China does not want to be dependent on imports of food. They are, to a large extent, import very large amounts of agricultural products. soybeans being the biggest single part of it. But they don't want that, so they have an industrial policy designed to reduce that. Two, if you look at when they do buy soybeans, they buy beans. They never buy the processed product, right? Just because they want the upstream value in their own country. Three, they have a relationship with Brazil, which is the competitor, that they're trying to leverage. And they're trying to leverage that for geopolitical reasons. One, there's a president down there, Lula, who's anti-American, and they look upon that as a footnote, as a way to influence politics in our hemisphere. And they're using this leverage to do it. And as a subset of that, they're also using the soybean purchases and the like to allow them to get a foothold into Brazil. It'll help them in critical minerals and a whole lot of other things. So there's the fact that they're a geopolitical adversary. Two, the fact that they, as a matter of economic policy, don't want to be dependent on us. Three, they have the Brazil thing they're leveraging. And then the fourth thing is they're kind of reacting to other things that are going on in the market. So in the long run, we have to realize that China buying soybeans is not going to be a reliable customer, just period, full stop. They don't want to be a customer, and then there's too many other things going on. So I think, that all of us, this is not just a farmer's problem, this is a U.S. economic policymakers problem. We have to figure out our way around that. In terms of the first two, Mexico and Canada, that's kind of on track. We have USMCA talks. The reality is, as I say, we have a deficit in those areas, and it's important that the United States leverage market access to get rid of that deficit, in my opinion. With respect to China, it's a whole different ballgame. And in the first place, people have to begin with the proposition that they are not reliable and they are an adversary. And to be reliant on an adversary is a very precarious thing. You do it while you do it, and you don't do it when you realize that down the road it's not going to work out, and it just cannot work out.
Your talk here at the Economic Summit is inside the negotiation room, and being here in Iowa and Iowa Farm Bureau, we're very focused on agriculture, but tell us, how do you balance all the different interests about trade in the different sectors, and where does agriculture fit in to that picture, and how do you arrive at what you would see as a good agreement for trade?
So that's a really good sort of fundamental question, Tom. First of all, agriculture as a percent of our GDP is smaller than agriculture as a political component of our society, right? Agriculture outhits its weight by a fair amount, and it's because of politics, right? It's because agriculture, looking at it from a kind of a poli-sci point of view, agriculture is a political entity, and they vote one way. Looking at it as a kind of a conservative, which I consider myself to be, agriculture represents sort of basic values that are sort of fundamental to the kind of thing the United States wants to be. And so it has extra weight for that reason too. So there's a lot of reasons why we put pressure on agriculture. A third thing is that a healthy agricultural economy is absolutely essential to national security. You're not going to have it without it. It is as essential as being able to make bombs and radar and the like. So there's a lot of reasons why we put pressure on agriculture. If you look at trade generally, as I say, in my judgment, the system has failed dramatically. We have these huge trade deficits that are now systemic. They're not at all the way it was supposed to be, where you'd be surplus some years, deficit others. The world economy is growing because the United States is transferring wealth overseas in return for current consumption. And that's just not something that can go on for long. A good point, just to sort of show you how dire the situation is, there's a statistic which I use a lot called the net international investment position of a country, which is basically how much all Americans own overseas versus how much everyone else owns in America. That number for America right now is a negative $27 trillion. If you go back 20 years, it was a negative $2 trillion. And if you go back to when I was in the Reagan administration, of course, it was a very large positive number. So the system that we have is not working. And I would say it's not working for manufacturing, and it's not working for agriculture, just period. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't some parts of agriculture or some parts of the economy for which it has been successful, but overall it has not been successful. So I think we need to kind of reorient the policy. We need to get one that gets us back towards balance. The other way I think about it is, as I say, no sector has been more a victim of protectionism abroad than agriculture. I mean, we have, particularly when you look at commodities, we have the most efficient, the most productive sectors in the world, just period. But yet we don't have giant surpluses. Now, why is that? Other people are doing things to offset our advantage. And that brings me back to this kind of point, which is that there really isn't any free trade. You've got to go out there and you've got to work it on a day-by-day basis, and you've got to make sure at the end of the day we're selling more than we're buying over some period of time. Now, economists would tell you it doesn't matter. I don't agree with that. And one of the analogies that Warren Buffett used years ago when he wrote an article and he talked about this was, he said, take a farmer that's got 100 acres under agriculture, and every year he sells 10 acres to consume. When the 11th year comes around, he has no farm and he can't consume. You know what I mean? That's really what the United States is doing, and it's a very foolish policy. Fortunately, President Trump reoriented it, and fortunately, President Biden didn't change the direction of that policy, and now we're in a position where the president's trying to get to the next step. But there's no way that we can correct this problem and not have it benefit agriculture. So, to reverse, if we correct this problem, it's going to clearly benefit agriculture because we have a deficit in agricultural products, and because the agriculture economy benefits when the economy generally does well also. There's a lot of things independently, weather and conditions in other countries and the like, that can affect agriculture's bottom line. But if the United States is doing very badly, if we're in a recession or, God help us, a depression, agriculture suffers as much as anyone, and in some areas more.
We've talked a little bit about USMCA, and we've reached that July 1 milestone for the 6-year review. That was one of the signature achievements of the first Trump administration. You had obviously a major role in that. You've mentioned there are problems. What are you hearing, if anything, about changes the administration may be seeking in these renegotiations or this review? And what are the real areas of contention with those two countries?
So let's remind ourselves, if we kind of go back, we had an agreement in 1988, which was the U.S.-Canada agreement. And then as we approached 1994, 3 and 4, we added Mexico to that agreement, which changed the nature of it dramatically. It was a reasonably unpopular agreement that then became very unpopular. This is NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. So everybody who ran as a Republican or a Democrat for national office said they were going to renegotiate it, but none of them ever did. When we got to the point with President Trump in his first term, he said, I'm either going to renegotiate or get out of it. So we renegotiated, and I think vastly improved it. We gained additional access in agriculture. That was one of our objectives. We had some very contentious talks with Canada, particularly in dairy, because Canada is their agricultural system generally, but particularly the East Coast and the dairy system is very, very much the opposite of free economics. But I think we helped ourselves substantially. We helped ourselves in wheat in Canada also. But if you kind of look at where we are, particularly with Mexico, we have gotten a large trade deficit to the point that the surplus that Mexico has with the United States is probably 10% of their entire GDP, which is kind of a staggering thought. Their exports to the United States are about 29% of their GDP. That's real reliance, right? If we had anybody that we were in that position with, we'd be in a panic. But they're running up large deficits, and so the president wants to get this back to balance. Some of the deficit, I should say, with Mexico is not a problem, particularly because to the extent we're transferring manufacturing from China to Mexico to sell to the United States, I would argue at least that that's in our interest. A strong Mexico is in the interest of the United States. A strong China is not particularly. But having said that, there are a number of areas, and most of them do not really involve agriculture, where the administration will focus. One, there are rules of origin, which is when a product comes in and gets the benefit of duty-free treatment, how much of it is going to be U.S. content, how much of it is going to be regional content, and can we minimize content from places like China so that the benefit of this agreement is in the United States. My guess is you're going to see a kind of some imaginative changes. You're going to see some changes in rules of origin. You're going to see some additional products besides automobiles in the rules of origin category. I think you're going to see some additional access, particularly in Canada, some small additional access, but that could be very important to sectors, to parts of the agriculture economy. So I think you're going to see a variety of changes, but mostly you're going to see things that are designed to get the trade deficit down. And obviously I agree with that. As a general matter, I don't focus on bilateral trade deficits. I focus on the global trade deficit. Because, for example, if you're buying energy from someone and you have a trade deficit, well, that might not be a bad thing, as long as globally you have balanced trade. But if you're going to try to get $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion trade deficit down, you've got to go to the big surplus countries, and those are China, Europe, Mexico, right, Vietnam. So the president has focused on those. And I think you're going to see an agreement. The other thing to think about, and I've kind of alluded to this, is that USMCA is really two trade agreements, right? It's really the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico. Mexico and Canada don't trade a lot, and to the extent they do, it's covered by TPP anyway, so it doesn't really have that much, except in some technical case here or there. So as a general matter, I think what you're going to see are really kind of separate negotiations. I'm going to see the United States with certain objectives, and I think you're going to see some changes in a variety of things, but rules of origin and these kind of technical things. And I think you're going to end up with some tariffs as part of the system, built-in tariffs. Because when you think of USMCA, you have to think about it in terms of these 232s in steel and aluminum and automobiles and the like, and how they relate to that. And I think you're going to see some tariffs built into the agreement, which is something that's not really been part of trade agreements in the past, but I think you're going to see it in this case.
I thought it was very interesting, your comment about looking at not bilateral trade deficits, but global trade deficits and striking a global balance. But what's the best way to achieve that? Are these bilateral deals, say, preferred to something like the World Trade Organization, which was a big push, 20 years ago? Everything was focused on the big 160 plus countries in the World Trade Organization. What do you see as the best way to reach that global trade balance?
Well, for us, for sure it has to be bilateral. Let's kind of talk about this. If you think about trade policy historically, let's just start with World War II. You have the world decimated, the United States, the strongest country in the world. And we entered into a system of a multilateral system. And we did a series of rounds. We did 9 rounds to kind of really get tariffs down. A, the focus was on tariffs, not industrial policy. And B, it was on really the countries that had something to give, giving something. And we saw, we won the Cold War, we saw the rebuilding of Europe, we saw the rebuilding of much of Asia, so there were a lot of good things came out of it. By the time you got into the 90s, there was this kind of hubris that communism was dead and, the Soviet Union was gone and China hadn't arrived in any real way since. And so we had this kind of hubris, and we became very focused on the global system. A few things happened. One is most countries changed from tariffs to non-tariff barriers to kind of get themselves in a position where they want a surplus. 2, we talked about free trade, but nobody really believed it. It was, kind of a fraud. Everyone wanted a surplus for the same reason that everybody listening to this podcast wants a surplus. None of them want to consume more than they produce, because that doesn't make you rich, it makes you poor. So if you think about the multilateral system, there were 9 rounds up until the mid-90s, the last one being the Uruguay round, which created the WTO, transferred the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, to the WTO. Since then, and that's been 30 years, there's been no trade multilateral negotiations or agreements of any kind. Part of what happened was that we changed the trading system to a litigation system. And we have this appellate body system and all this. So people would say, why should I negotiate with America? I'll just sue them in the WTO. And there'll be some judge from, Sri Lanka or someone, and he'll decide the United States should lose. And now we've kind of corrected that by not agreeing to putting people on the appellate body. But for a long period of time, that was the case. And if you look at it, there have been no negotiations, right? There are no negotiations. So it isn't even like we decided it. It's the system itself just evolved to one of bilateralism. Another way to think of it is, if you think about Europe Europe basically didn't engage in any multilateral talks at all. What they did is went out and did a bunch of free trade agreements to try to get access that way, all of which were bilateral talks, and they have 20 some of them, maybe more than that, maybe 30 now. So the system has evolved like that. The WTO is a joke. It doesn't do anything. And it's up to every country to create a system that works for its own economy and for its constituents. And everybody wants the same thing. They talk about free trade and market efficiency, and they want protectionism at home and access abroad, and they want to have trade surpluses. And countries like China have been a lot better at it than we have. And other countries too. It isn't just China, Japan. We can go through the history of Japanese trade, Germany, Ireland in an ironic sort of way. So, we know who the countries are, but nobody believes in the multilateral system at all. It's done nothing for an entire generation, and we're in a bilateral world. And President Trump embraces that world, but he didn't create it. It's the way it is for reasons beyond his control.
One of the frustrations, even after you negotiate a good trade deal, is other countries not living up to what they agreed to or finding workarounds. You mentioned Canada with dairy. And it just takes so long to resolve those disputes, and you appeal to a judge. Is there a way to build a quicker dispute resolution process into these trade deals, or what's the ideal situation there?
I have kind of evolved my own thinking on this. There was a time when I thought that made sense. I don't now. I think you monitor it yourself and you act if you think you're not getting your way. I can remember when we were doing the Phase 1 agreement with China, I just sort of said to my counterpart, who was a very smart man, I said, look, no dispute settlement system's going to work. Who are we going to get third parties to do it and try to influence them? Or are we going to have two Americans and one Chinese? We're going to win that case. Two Chinese and one American, you're going to win that case. It doesn't make any sense. So what we said is what we need to do is have a system wherein you can bring disputes and talk about them and try to resolve them, very much like we did in the GATT before we went to the WTO. And if we can't, then it's the jungle. And, one of the nice things about the jungle is that, we're the biggest elephant. So, we have to enforce our own rules. The thought that you're going to somehow, there is nothing that can duplicate the American judicial system. And that's what people are thinking about when they ask this question, right? Is can we do something like that where there's just mostly objective, honest people sitting down trying to look at a text and say, here's who's right, who's wrong. There isn't any way to do that in this system. So I think what we have to do is just be ever vigilant, act in our own, and realize that there'll be times when that'll lead to inefficiency and the like, but you have to do it because you can't be in a position where you make an agreement and people don't live up to it.
Another thing that affects farmers is sort of the reporting around these trade agreements. You mentioned the China Phase 1 targets, and they set the standard for soybeans, and so every headline was, are they meeting those targets? So, are they behind? Are they ahead? And that type of reporting. So for farmers trying to make decisions today, and these headlines can impact things, what's real out there? What signs should they be watching for this next 6 to 12 months to know whether we're starting to make real progress in agricultural trade?
Well, that's a difficult question. You have to once again break it down. You can see the trends in most places pretty quickly, and you know what the kind of hot buttons are. Obviously, the hot buttons are the value of the currency, what Brazil is doing, what China is doing geopolitically. If the question is, does China live up to its commitments to purchase? The answer is, if you had to say one word, it's of course not. But when they're required to, and when it's in their interest, and the answer is yes. So you've seen them buy soybeans from the United States, even though our price is a little bit higher. Obviously, now they're not doing that because they're generous, sweet, kind people and like Iowa farmers, right? They're doing it because they're leveraging something that they think is more valuable. And in this case, it's running several $100 billion trade surplus with the United States. So, as I say, I don't have any confidence in China long run at all. You can be sure they're going to do what's in their interest, but they have geopolitical considerations and a whole lot going on besides just buying the lowest priced product. And when you get to some products, to be honest, soybeans being one, we don't even have the lowest priced product really for a variety of reasons. And And that gets you to the whole, when I talk to farmers, I have to remind them, you're part of an ecosystem. And China, for example, manipulates their currency. Other countries do too. So if the dollar's overvalued, farmers lose their competitiveness, period, full stop. Now, you can say, an economist to say, yeah, well, they can buy more televisions. And my view is farmers don't need more televisions. What farmers need is a market to sell product in. And the higher the value of your currency is, you know what I mean? There are basic economic things that are creating problems for us. The higher your currency is, the less competitive you are, period. And that's true for automobiles, farmers. It's true for every U.S. exporter. And also, the cheaper your competitors are in your market. So the cheaper it is for Brazil to come in here and take some of our market. So there's just an awful lot that goes into that question. And the profitability of agriculture, you know, is something that I can talk about. But my guess is, in a practical way, 90% of your listeners know more about it than I do. On the trade side of it, you know, I think we're in reasonably good shape. I think the president is not going to let us, he's going to use U.S. power not to let us end up getting, a term he uses, ripped off. And we've been getting ripped off too long in a whole variety of areas, and now you can see it in agriculture flat out. So he's just not going to let that happen. And what you have to do is just fight every battle every day. What you're going to do is look at your bottom line, imports, exports, profits, losses, and act every single day to do something to help your people. And that's what I think the president's going to do. And that's what he has been doing, right? He's a business guy. That's what business guys do. They sit there and they say, okay, as a practical matter, my objective is to have a healthy ag community, healthy farms. I would take a step forward as a kind of an economic analyst, and I want hard-working farmers to stay married, to raise their children, to stay in communities. I mean, those are the objectives of economic policy. The objective of economic policy is not the cheapest T-shirt, the way I think about it. So our economic policy should be, I want happy, contented agriculture families. That's what should be our objective. And the same thing for manufacturing workers. That should be our objective. And I think the president sees that. But there's no theoretical answer. There's no quick solution, in my opinion. And I've been doing this since the late 70s. In fact, interestingly, I was telling someone yesterday, the first big deal that I did, the first big deal that I negotiated was the U.S. Soviet Union long-term grain agreement. Mm-hmm. And I negotiated that in 1983. And just for those of your listeners who are really, really old, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter stopped agriculture sales, which wasn't in those days a lot of soybeans, but it was a lot of corn, a lot of wheat, and some other things. Of course, that just created competition in Argentina at that time, but also Brazil and other places. And then when Reagan was elected, remember that was the evil empire days and all of that, by 1983, he wanted to put in place another long-term grain agreement, and I negotiated that during that period. And basically what our commitment was to force the Soviet Union to buy large quantities of U.S. agriculture. And we ended up succeeding on that and signed that agreement in late 83.
So we talked about China's investment in Brazil and kind of a cohesive relationship there. Where are the next markets for U.S. agriculture and otherwise that we should be focusing on?
Well, the first one, I don't want to present myself as an agricultural, trade economist, because I'm not. But I think there are a lot of non-traditional markets, and you've seen the United States in this administration enter into 9 kind of, not really FTA agreements, but kind of trade agreements with countries, and then another 9, which included some big countries like Japan and the EU, kind of memorandum of understanding, sort of framework agreements. But I think there are a lot of places where the United States has geopolitical power or economic power, because we have unbalanced economic relationships, where we can leverage that relationship to get more exports. And the easiest things to export, to be honest, are agriculture, and at least until recently, Boeing airplanes, right? It was because there's not a lot of competition out there. But when I would go around, when I was at USTR, the 3 things you could get people to buy would be LNG, agricultural products, at least that they could use, and then of course airplanes if they had an airline industry. But I think there's going to have to be looking at more non-traditional markets in terms of exports. The other thing I would just say, and once again this is kind of out of my field of expertise, but it's kind of worth mentioning. I think people have to start thinking about moving up the value chain. I mean, it's the most natural thing in the world, and I think people do think about it, but I think we have to have a real government program to help us move up the value chain, particularly in soybeans. We've done it in corn and some other areas. I think we have to, and once again, this is out of my field, but I think we have to become less dependent on soybeans. The competition is going to be stronger. And even there, we have to get ourselves to move up the value chain. And then I think we have to get away from China, because I think China is ultimately going to get away from us. So we have to, to the extent we maintain dependence there. Now, I'm not saying don't sell to them. Obviously, sell to them as long as you can. But is your long-term plan can't have that be 60% of your market. It's just not going to work.
We appreciate the ambassador taking time to visit with Iowa farmers and state his position on this crucial issue for agriculture. I think there's one thing that's perfectly clear. Whether you're an advocate for tariffs like Ambassador Lighthizer or an advocate for free trade like Dr. Gregg, everyone agrees that trade is absolutely crucial for agriculture, especially here in Iowa. That's why Farm Bureau will continue to take members abroad and explore promising international markets. It's why we'll continue working with policymakers, helping them understand the implications of their decisions for U.S. agriculture. And it's why we'll continue to work alongside farmers to add value to their products, creating more market opportunities at home and abroad. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and you'll tune in to our next episode on August 17th, which times up perfectly with the 2026 Iowa State Fair. If you're out at the Iowa State Fair, which runs from August 13th through the 23rd, we hope you'll stop by Farm Bureau Park, where we'll be celebrating how farmers protect our environment and grow our country. We'll have free educational games, prizes, and a special gift for Farm Bureau members who drop by, a free American flag celebrating America 250. You can learn more about it using the link down in the notes for this podcast episode, or by heading out to iowafarmbureau.com/state fair. Our freedom is rooted in the work you're doing on your farm, and we look forward to celebrating that at the fair. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.